So I suggest we make a start, as I think everyone who wants to attend is here. So welcome everyone to the new academic year and the new series of seminars of our evaluation center, or research center on evaluation and accountability. I'm really pleased to have you all here for a really interesting number of talks, I think. What I'd like to do as a start is to just kind of set you off with describing the background to the presentations and why we thought it would be really relevant to have a seminar series on accountability of networks. So networks, I mean, those of you who are working here in the English context will probably think of multi-academy trusts as an example of educational networks, but we've seen how other education systems, particularly in Europe, are also moving towards becoming more networked, where networks are becoming the dominant mode almost for ensuring that schools collaborate, and how that is becoming the main strategy for school improvement in many countries. And this statement from a recent white paper from the Department for Education really highlights the importance of networks for the UK context. In that white paper, it talks about how multi-academy trusts are becoming the only or the most dominant structures to formally bring together leadership, autonomy, funding and accountability across a group of academies, and how that is supposed to be a kind of sustainable way to ensure collaboration between schools, and how that's supposed to be an arrangement where schools that are performing well are supporting the more weaker schools to learn the tips and tricks almost of how to provide good education. So with that strategy of networking becoming so dominant, we really need to ask ourselves, is that going to work? Is that going to be a better strategy to promote improvement of schools than the more traditional strategies which focus on individual schools and supporting individual schools in improvement? So that's kind of the key question to the seminar this morning. So multi-academy trusts are the most dominant type of network here in the UK, but multi-academy trusts are very varied as well in terms of how they shape collaboration between schools and what it is that schools are collaborating on. So some examples of what that would look like are within phase and cross-phase formal and informal networks of schools, such as multi-academy trusts that have primary schools and secondary schools, and where there is a benefit for students who stay within the multi-academy trust when they, for example, transition from primary to secondary schools within the trust. But many multi-academy trusts also only have schools within one sector. So that's kind of an example of how multi-academy trusts are varied and the type of variation that we see in educational networks in other countries as well. There's also quite a lot of variation in where we talk about formal networks or more informal ones. The multi-academy trusts are a real example of a more formal network where there are kind of structures, schemes of delegation, etc. in place which organize the collaboration between schools. But there are many examples, obviously, of informal networks as well, where schools just come together on a more informal basis to exchange good practice or share professional development. So what are the implications of having more formal or informal structures in place in terms of student outcomes, in terms of individual school improvement? Those are some of the questions that we've been grappling with as well. we also see, particularly in some of the other countries that we've been working with, that networks not only include schools, but oftentimes also other service providers, such as youth services working with children. And then the network not only becomes about school improvement, but also has a kind of wider role in supporting children throughout their lifespan, ensuring that how they grow up and are taught in schools becomes kind of a joined up experience where other services are provided in close collaboration with schools. So those are also examples of networks that are really relevant when we think about student outcomes. What we're talking about today are inter-organizational networks, and what we mean by that is that we're talking particularly about formal arrangements of a multitude of public and private organizations, agencies and departments that have been constituted to facilitate collective action. And the idea of collective action is really important here, because we're talking about some kind of joint outcome of the network where they establish or work towards something that individual partners or schools on their own could not achieve independently. So an example of that might be where we have a multi-academy trust that has both primary and secondary schools, that the collaboration of those schools leads to improved transitioning of students from primary to secondary education. So that's an example of a collective outcome that could not be achieved by individual members of the network alone. So the real purpose of networks is thinking about what that collective action looks like and what the joint purpose of that network is. Just school improvement of individual schools is in England an important outcome, but we are really also interested in if the networking and collaboration actually leads to something else as well. So it's talking about joint responsibility and how the network arrangement ensures that partners within that network actually feel that joint responsibility. So some of the topics, questions that I hope we'll be able to discuss today that presenters will talk about in their presentations. The idea of the increasing prevalence and unique value proposition of networks, where in some cases, such as in Chile, they've been also introduced to ensure that schools collaborate instead of compete with each other. So the introduction of networks there has had a purpose in shifting the education system as a whole from one that is predominantly about competition towards more collaboration. How does that work when you introduce networks into such a competitive system, when schools are really used to competing with each other? How do they change their habits? Do they change their routines, their way of thinking about their role in the system towards a more collaborative one? I'm hoping we can have an opportunity to hear from Chile how that's working out there. Patrick Keynes is also going to talk about the paradox of networks, where there is a tension between hopefully increased benefits for end users, which would be in the education, learners, students, and how they are supposed to benefit from the fact that the school is part of a network, but also how members of that network often have to struggle with decreased autonomy, where they have to relinquish some of their responsibility to maybe a trust or other partners in the network, and how that sometimes creates a paradox and tension within that network. And they were also really interested in the role of evaluation and accountability, and that's been particularly my work over the last couple of years. When do we need to introduce evaluation and accountability of a network? It's a really key question here in England as well, with multi-academy trusts that have only so far or mostly seen accountability of their individual members and not so much of the network and the trust as a whole. But it seems that that is changing as Ofsted is working on a framework to inspect multi-academy trusts as well. So what should that look like? What should be some of the standards within that network? How do we need to understand performance and functioning of those networks? And when do we need to introduce a framework like that? Some of the work around networks really talks about how networks need to build trust first, and external accountability when implemented at the start of a network really produces that trust and often prevents schools from setting up collaborative arrangements when they have to meet a high stakes external accountability framework. So perhaps it's a good thing to not introduce accountability from the start, but give the network an opportunity to build that trust and collaboration before you hold them accountable on an external framework. So those are some of the questions that we've been working on in our projects as well. And then finally, issues around unintended consequences of networks. I mean, we often seem to think that networking is a good thing, collaboration is beneficial, but we also know from the literature that networks have many unintended consequences as well in terms of transaction costs, lots of time spent on coordinating the collaboration, meeting up with other partners in the network, power struggles, having to deal with issues or conflict between schools. Here in England, we've seen multi-academy trusts that have schools across the country, so the time it takes to actually coordinate work of partners that are so geographically far away from each other takes up quite a lot of time, and that time has to come from somewhere. So those are some of the unintended consequences that we've also seen from networks. And how can evaluation and accountability address those and actually improve the collaboration between partners? Or do we even see new unintended consequences from external accountability? So many questions and topics just to get your mind kind of started and thinking about some of the issues that we face when we talk about educational networks, just to get you kind of thinking about what are some of the key themes that are relevant here when we start our presentation. So more information about my work, particularly on educational networks here in England, but also in Northern Ireland, in the Netherlands and in Bulgaria, and particularly the accountability of that are on this website should you be interested. And I'd like to introduce the two guest speakers for this morning. We start with Professor Patrick Kenis from the Netherlands, Tilburg University, who's done quite a lot of work on policy networks, not just in education, but also in other sectors. So I'm really pleased that he's here to share some of his work. We've actually used quite a lot of his work when we were working on the European project on educational networks, because his work provides such a good understanding of different types of networks and thinking about how that relates to external accountability as well. And then we have Alvaro Gonzalez, who's here also for BERA, I think, next week, the conference. So it's a good opportunity to have him here for a session as well to talk about the introduction of the new education networks in Chile. And Alvaro is also a PhD student here at the Institute, so he knows the place quite well. We're really pleased to have him back for a talk. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce Professor Patrick Kenis, who will talk about the promises and challenges of organizational networks. This is yours, right? Yeah. Okay. I need to
change that.
Yes. You want me to do that?
I think it's fine.
Yeah. You can hold it or just put it in.
It's fine? Yeah. So, good morning. Thank you for the invitation. On the original invitation, I was mentioned to be in Vienna. I did a sabbatical in Vienna, but now I'm working in Tilburg, where I have been working before. I had a chair in policy and organization studies, so looking at the functioning of organizations in a policy context. Now I have a chair in public governance in the economics faculty in Tilburg since the 1st of July. And thank you very much for the invitation. I'm not a specialist in education. I've done a little bit of work. Just recently done a small consultancy on organizational networks in a Dutch context. I will talk about that. And otherwise, my expertise is really in organization networks. That's what I'm working on for, I think, 20, 30 years already, before it became a hype. But I decided, nevertheless, to start studying them, and it was a good kind of investment. So I have learned a lot about this phenomena. For me, and maybe most of you are interested in persons and students and children probably, but I have a passion for organizations. So I'm sorry about that. I will talk about organizations. That's my passion. Yeah. But of course, the functioning of organization is very much related to what persons, children, youngsters get as a kind of a service or an offer or an environment in which they can function. So organization networks, for me, it's an organizational form. It's an organizational design, and that's my bigger field, organizational design. And within that field of organizational design, I specialized in organizational networks. And I try to explain what they are, why they are so interesting, but also why they are so difficult, and why we need to probably study them more in the future. I just took something from a UN report on the public sector from 2015. It's an interesting report, and you see here a kind of an interesting statement. The traditional way of ensuring accountability assumed that the majority of initiatives and actions were controlled by a single public agency. That was for a long time like this. You have a public agency, a single public agency, and you look at the accountability. And yet, increasingly complex reality has changed this paradigm. Traditional forms of vertical accountability for delegated authority must now be reconciled with the need to operate through vast networks of organizations. So they mentioned these network of organizations here, and so a new role for the government, a new role for accountability, and so on. So what I am saying here, we have a new form of organization, these networks of organizations, and we have to think about the things we were thinking before, accountability, functioning, processes, and so on and so forth. So that's the kind of the call. The question is really whether they are very clear about what networks of organizations are, and that's actually what I want to explain, and different forms of networks of organizations. So my storyline is what exactly are networks of organizations, as far as we have tried to describe them. And then I'm talking about two paradoxes. I mentioned one in the beginning, but I decided to talk about two. There is a collaboration paradox, and there is a differentiation integration paradox, and I will explain what these are. And the question is, how can we deal with these paradoxes? Because the basis for a good functioning of an organizational network will be to deal, not to solve, because paradoxes by definition you cannot solve them, but you have to learn to deal with them. And the question is, how can you deal with these paradoxes? That will be my storyline. I start with, when we talk about organizations networks, it's about connecting organizations. So you have independent organizations, and they need to be connected to each other. And I show a graph. It's one of the most used graphs in the field of connecting organizations, and I don't like it at all. I don't like it at all. I hope nobody has used that in his or her publications, but I don't want to be offensive. But this graph, it's actually from researchers, US researchers who were studying alliances between companies, airline companies. And they came up with this idea. Now this graph is taken from the Journal of Integrative Care. How is it called? The International Journal of Integrated Care, which is all about collaborating organizations, this whole journal, Integrated Care. And what you see in this graph, it looks like a two-dimensional graph, and it says there is an external or shared decision-making between organizations, and here is the duration of commitment. What it actually says, it's kind of one-dimensional. It says the more you start working together, at the end of the day, you will end up in a merger or acquisition. That's what this graph says. I find this a very sad story, because it tells you that when you start to collaborate with other organizations, at the end you won't exist anymore. Yeah, that's what this story tells you. Now this story is one of the reasons I'm working a lot with directors of organizations, or board of directors, or supervisory boards. That's one of the reasons why they are very negative towards collaboration with other organizations. Because I think when we start collaborating with other organizations, that's actually the end of my organization. No director and no a member of the board wants that, and I think that's a lot of hassle. We have to dismay people and so on and so forth. So that's one of the that graph, which is in the mind of many people, and all the people who are in business courses, will see this graph at a certain time. So that's in their mindset. So I think be very careful with showing that that graph when you're in the field, because people will immediately think, no, I will certainly not go this way. Yeah. So the question is there another way? Yeah. When we talk about ways of connecting organizations. Now what I did, I made a triangle. That's very often a way. Some people like circles, but I like triangles. Won't explain why, but I made a triangle, and on that level you have actually the graph which we saw before. You're an autonomous organization, you start contracting with other organizations, and you will end up in a merger and acquisition. And that's fine. For some situations that's fine as well. There might be very good reasons to kind of get together as organizations, to have an acquisition or to merge as organizations. There might be very good reasons. But that's not the kind of line I'm interested at this moment. I want to take another route, and that's this route. There must be a way of connecting autonomous organizations while they stay autonomous. Yeah, and that we see very often in practice as well. And the basic idea, and that's a title from a journal of American colleagues, and the title is Shrinking Core, Expanding Periphery. And that is what you very often see these days. Many organizations, and that's also true in education, but it's on many organizations, public, non-profit, private organizations, they're going back to their core. Yeah, that's also core. It's also called the what is it called? The core of what you're doing. Yeah, I have a nice word for that.
Primary process?
Yeah, no, not a primary process, but yeah, whatever. I'll come to that later. But so it's going back to what your organization is really about. So many organizations say we have done too many things in the past and we're dealing with too many issues. We have to go back to the core from what we do. We're an organization. Why are we doing all this care and taking care of all kinds of issues? We're an education organization, and we are here for education, and that's what we should go back to and to focus on. You see more and more organizations doing that because they became bigger and bigger. But at the other side, you see that many problems become complexer, bigger, and therefore you cannot solve them yourself, and that's the reason to expand to the periphery. So as an organization, you know there are some issues with young people when it comes to issues at home or care issues and so on and so forth. And as a school you say, we're not going to solve that. We are responsible for education, but we are concerned about these issues, and so we will have contact with other organizations to look how that could be working. So that's a kind of something you see, and that's also from that article. And you see that that's all cases from business, but it would be also nice to think about that in terms of education, for example. Yeah, you see truck manufacturing, for example. The traditional product is trucks. Then they started to develop value-added services like financing and service. Then they had a kind of a traditional value proposition. We sell and service trucks. And what you see these days, and you see that with many companies, they go to a new solution value proposition. So they look at the solution and they say, we can help you reduce your life cycle transportation costs. So that's a new value proposition. And this type of value proposition is a value proposition as a truck manufacturer you can never do that on your own. You can do that only with a whole set of other organizations. That's actually the idea. And you see in chemicals, pharmaceuticals, telecom, they started to produce phones, and then they say we can be your single point connection to the world. But you can never do that alone. You do that with other companies as well. So, and that's a kind of a tendency you see among many organizations. And it would be a nice exercise to think in terms of education, what would you like to put here as a kind of a new value proposition for education, and then thinking of can a school, for example, or an education institute, can they do it alone, or who do they need to make this happen? So that's something you see. So you have the shrinking core, expanding periphery, connecting autonomous organizations, and then, as far as I know, in our research, we find three kinds of ways organizations connect to each other. And it's quite important to understand that, because the logic of these three forms is quite different and has different implications. Because when I listen to people about networks, it's like it's all the same. Yeah? There is just one network, it's dots, and there are some arrows between them, and that's a network. But from an organizational design perspective, there are different forms. And one of the forms is a so-called learning networks. That's how we call it in the Netherlands and in Belgium. I don't know how you call them. Do you have something like that, learning networks? That's actually networks where organizations get together and they learn from each other. They learn from each other's experience, they sit around the table and they talk to each other. And what they actually do, they get new knowledge, because you suppose that when you go to a meeting with other organizations and you talk about new policy developments or some developments among young children using, should they use their phone during class or not, and these kind of things, and you can learn from that. We call that learning networks. That is a very popular. This is a very popular way of working together with other organizations. And why is that? Because it doesn't do anything to your organization. You just go there, you listen, you go in the car or the underground, and you think, was this interesting? Can I use anything of that? Will I report that back or not? And that's it. There's no kind of other commitment into that system, except when you go to a meeting, you expect also to exchange information. But to the core of the organization, it doesn't do really anything. Yeah, so that's a very popular way of collaboration. Most organizations won't have any problem with collaborating in this way, because it doesn't do anything to your organization as such. Another way is that's called a shared SSC, that's called a shared service center. That is actually a way where you decide with other organizations to do something together, which you did before, but you will not do it anymore. Yeah, for example, 2 or 4 hospitals deciding to stop washing their, how do you call that? Bed linen. Yeah, yeah. You think washing bed linen as a hospital, that's not where we are here. Yeah, we find it important, but it's not why we are here. And we decided to do it with other organizations, and we asked 3 other hospitals in the area, and we start a new organization or company for washing our linen. Yeah, and that's a shared service center, and that you see very often also. The nice thing about the shared service center is most of the time it has an efficiency effect. And that means you suppose, which very often doesn't happen, but that's another story, but you suppose that the washing of your linen becomes less expensive than before. And there have been some projects in the Netherlands. There has been a project recently of 7 hospitals building a shared service center for their ICT, for information technology, and they calculated that was an efficiency gain of 12 million euro, which they actually can now invest in the primary process of what they're doing. So that's the shared service proposition. That's also fine, and it does something to your organization, because you decide to do something what you did before. You don't do it anymore, but you kind of take it out of the organization. But the primary process of your organization is not actually is not changing in any way, because washing the linen was not part of your kind of core business. So the core business of the organization stays as it is, but you take something out. And then we have the third way, and that's the one I would like to focus on, and I call that an organization network. That's a term we can use. It's not a network organization, because a network organization is an organization which is organized like a network, and an organization network is a network of organizations. But maybe that's bad English, whatever. But that's how I define it. And what does an organization network do? It does something, it produces something new, something which wouldn't be there if the organization network would not do it. Yeah? And none of the organizations independently could do it. Yeah? That's the idea of the organization network. Yeah? So the kind of propositions I mentioned here before, these you cannot do on your own. If you wouldn't do it with other organizations, it wouldn't be there, and that's why here I mention effectiveness. So from that perspective, efficiency and effectiveness are quite different things. Now, one of the problems, at least in the Netherlands, is that the overheid, the government, or government agencies, they say to the organization, you should work more together because that's more efficient and more effective. Yeah, I don't know whether this is claimed here as well, but this efficiency and effectiveness is always coming together, and that efficiency is certainly true for the shared service centers, but here effectiveness is the most important thing. And one of the things we know, when we build these organization networks, it's very difficult to be more efficient, because that is really a cost. And maybe at the end or in the long term it's more efficient, but in the short term, most of the projects take 2-3 years, certainly not, or 4 years, certainly not. So that's one of the interesting things. Now, what is here? The step here is also quite different, because in these organization networks, you really have to change things in your core business as an organization to participate in these kind of collaborative networks. And I will show that later, because that's one of the paradoxes. I put here to make it all a little bit more fuzzy, and and your English is probably better than mine, but I take this from the literature, that is very often called cooperation, this is called coordination, and this is called collaboration, because collaboration is the kind of deepest way of working together with organizations, because you really have to change some of your issues. Now here comes the first paradox, and the first paradox is the more you go from here to there is an increasing value for the end user. So if you say here learning networks, the end user, for example, if we take integrated care, the question is whether they really, or people with a chronic care situation, whether they really experience something when an organization has been part of a learning network. There might be an indirect effect, but it's very indirect. Here the effect is that maybe there is some money left for the primary processes and the care, could be. But here is a situation where, for example, in a situation where you have a network for or for people with as sexual abuse, for example, that's also a project, or child abuse, which I've been working on. When organizations get together, these 28 organizations, when they got together, they really had to change some things in the way of reporting, in the kind of services they offered, in the kind of people they hire to be part of the collaboration, and so forth and so forth. And you see that the end user gets a product, a kind of a solution, kind of a more holistic project or holistic solution, which is different from getting single service from any of the organizations, but is a kind of an integrated product. And this integrated product is then assumed to be much better than the sum of the parts. So for the end user, the value increases here. Now we have a problem. At the same time, there is a decrease in sovereignty of the organization. So the sovereignty of the organization, that is the capacity to be able to decide things on their own and to be kind of completely sovereign, decreases. Because here, as I said, you don't need to do anything with that really. Here is just a part of your organization, which is kind of taking out of organization. But here really you have to change your own kind of processes. You have to change maybe your division of labor, the type of tasks, the type of people you hire, and so on and so forth. So being part of that collaboration is actually taking some of your sovereignty. And here you have, for me, that is the first paradox, that's the collaboration paradox. Yeah? The more you engage in interesting projects, integrated projects, the more the chance exists that you will lose some sovereignty of your organization. A little bit like the European Union, as you might know. The theory was by putting these countries together, we increased the value for the end user. Yeah, and I saw that when I arrived at Heathrow yesterday. Yeah, as an EU citizen, I still had to be in line and so on and so forth. It was shorter than Alva's line, I suppose, but still, yeah, there was a line, and there was a little bit of hassle. So I supposed always that's the thing, but at the same time, you have a decrease in sovereignty of your organization, of your country. Actually, that's what the whole discussion was about, I think, in Britain, more or less. So you have the collaboration paradox, and the European Union is not really very well in finding solutions for this collaboration paradox, which we also see in the migration situation. That's exactly more or less the same, and the same you find in these organization networks. So this collaboration paradox, I just took a picture from internet, and that shows this a little bit. This is about integrated care, and you see all the kind of organizations, and the assumption is that these organizations have to work differently to make this kind of rolling this system, and not just it's not just a set of services which have to be added, but they also have to kind of be integrated in some way or the other. So what's the definition of this this organization network as a result of these first slides? We are talking about relatively stable cooperative relationships between 3 or more legally autonomous organizations based on horizontal rather than hierarchical coordination, recognizing one or more network or collective goals. So what you're producing here is, and Melanie said it already, you're producing outcomes which are collective outcomes which none of the organizations could actually produce on themselves, and so you have to do it together. And it's and the footnote is not an important, is important. So saying that there is no unity of ownership and there is no unity of authority, and that's the big issue here with this form of organization, because we're very, very much used, and we're also trained, and legal scholars are trained, and economists are trained, as if we can only organize things if there is a unit of ownership, so there is a legal person. Yeah, we need a legal person because otherwise we don't know how the liability, the accountability, and so on and so forth works. Economists would say we need authority because decisions have been taken, profit and loss has to be calculated, and all these kind of things. So we need all these kind of things, and then these things work. But here in this organizational form, we don't have that, and it's not because we don't have that not because we don't want it, but because if we would have it, it wouldn't be an organizational network anymore, and it would become a new organization, yeah, in the classical sense. Now the reason why this form is so strong in many cases is because it has some, it shows some flexibility. It is very good at tailor-made products and some other reasons. So flexibility and tailor-made offers, because the problem with a classical organization is they're very bad in tailor-made. So if you have kids and every kid needs something different, it becomes very difficult for classical organizations. Yeah, because they have their categories and they have their standards and they have this and that, and you put people in boxes, so to say. And here the idea is that because you have very many different organizations, you can make as many combinations as possible, and therefore you can produce really tailor-made services. So there's a good reason why, there's a very good reason why they're not organizations as such. Very often the differentiation of these organizations is also quite big. Yeah, just imagine this. If you would put all this, including your friends and your family and your yoga teacher, you would put them all in one organization. You would immediately a hierarchy would develop in which the medical specialist is the most important person, almost by definition. Yeah. So there are many good reasons why this is not the case, but that doesn't make our life simpler. And the question is, how can we deal with that? Now, what we see is that in many domains, yeah, and I've just listed them here. In many domains, you see this organizational form more and more often, and there is a kind of a tendency, and the tendency is related, and there was also in UN report you saw in the beginning, things become more complex, and people expect tailor-made services. That's one of the reasons why you see this tendency, and that's not just related to public services or non-profit services. It's also, I also work in industries very often, also in industries, and we saw also the sheet before. Also in industries, you see this tendency of using organization networks as the organizational form. I've taken an example here that is I find it a very interesting example that is from Kenya, and it shows actually again it's just an illustration of the collaboration paradox I was talking about before. that is this is about 175,000 dairy farmers. The dairy farmers, they have one cow. Cow, is that cow? Yeah, thank you. They have one cow, and the situation before was they didn't really know what to do with the milk, and if the cow became ill, yeah, they had a problem. Yeah, they didn't have the cow anymore after a couple of weeks, yeah, because it was dead. Yeah, and now for some reasons, and it's written in this article, it's a very nice article. For some reason or the other, a kind of an organization network developed, which is pictured here. And now these dairy farmers, they're not farmers who are thinking every day about how their cow is doing and what they can do with all the milk, but they're actually becoming entrepreneurs. Yeah, and this is a project which has been very successful in Kenya and is now also copied in other countries and so. And what you see here, you have many very different organizations involved. You have transporters, you have financial organizations, but you have also a training institute, so there is also education in it. What you also see here is there are public organizations in here, there are private organizations in here, and there are non-profit organizations in here. So a very different set of organizations in terms of legal status, but also in terms of the services they provide, and in what they do, and how they think about certain issues. So you have a very high level of differentiation, but the system works only if these organizations actually are willing to participate with the other organizations and therefore change some of the ways they have been doing before. Yeah, and that is actually what I call the paradox of collaboration. This paradox has to be, in some way or the other, has to be solved. I show another example, and it's an example I come back later. I will come back later. That's from education. That's in Dutch. It's wetpassend onderwijs. I don't know how you translate that, but I have found law for inclusive education. I found that not really 100% a very good description of what it is. Appropriate Education Act, it has also been called. But what it says, schools have the responsibility to provide a suitable learning place to every child, and then in the internet you find all these kinds of funny drawings, what that is, whatever. What schools must do, they must cooperate in regional alliance. That's one of the regions, and there you have 105 schools and 15 boards, because they're in groups of 15 groups of schools. And so they have to collaborate, and they have to make sure that for every child, independent of the status or the situation of that child should be part of education in some way or the other. And here you see, and that's a project where I did a small consultancy on. Here really you saw this. I have some water, I think. There I have it prepared, but in the wrong place in the room. So what you saw in this project, and I come back to that later. What you saw here is really this paradox. Because all the schools, in some way or the other, they had the feeling, I actually would like take the money from the government and actually continue the work as I did before with a little bit more money, and I take a little bit of care for some children, and that's it. But the idea of the government is that you can make this only happen if you collaborate, if the schools collaborate amongst each other. And I will talk about that later. And the question is, so how do we deal with this collaboration paradox? And I'll come back to that later. But before, I would like to introduce another paradox to make it even a little bit more complicated, and I call that the differentiation integration paradox, or the who is in charge problem. Yeah, because we said there is no unity of ownership, there is no unity of authority in the classical sense of the world. So how can this thing actually function? And that's based on a paradox. And I have taken another Dutch example, or an example from the Netherlands. This is actually taken out of a report of the Inspectorate for Youth and Care in the Netherlands. and it studied a specific case. It was a case of a household that's one family, just a family somewhere, who actually got services from 1990 until 2013. So it's all the services that one family, was a family, a woman who was married to or had a new partner and a daughter. 3 persons, and they got all these services. It's 22 services from the domain of health, the domain of education, the domain of family support, the domain of security, police and these kind of things, domain of housing, and domain of work and income. 22 organizations were, all these years, were busy with this one family. So that's what we call the social welfare state. Yeah? It's very nice to see that. But what happened, and that's why the report by the inspectorate was actually written, not about that single case, but about the problem in general, is that, and I'm sorry that is in Dutch, but the daughter who was living there, she was mentally retarded. She was 20, and she actually died. Yeah, and she fell off the stairs. But they think that the stepfather actually gave her a push, and so she died. And now the big puzzle for the inspector is, how is it possible that all these organizations have been in that household and have been working with this family and have been providing services, and this happened nevertheless. That's the kind of the big puzzle, and that they actually defined this as who is in charge a problem. Who was actually in charge to see how dramatic and how difficult that situation was, and how come nobody took responsibility. So that's one of the issues with organization networks, which you see in this case. And I'll come back to that later as well. This is another, I like this drawing very much. It's very, let's say, from our perspective, it's very Anglo-Saxon perspective, because it's also a drawing of an organizational network, but they actually start, yeah. We also have the tendency to draw a network, and then we have an arrow with an outcome to the right. But here, you're much more demand-driven. That's what they say in the Netherlands, that you are much more demand-driven. And you start with the demand, and the demand is a vulnerable adult able to live independently with a good quality of life in their own home. These are these 80-plus people who want still to live at home, are very vulnerable, and everybody kind of likes that. The state likes that, the family likes that, the person likes that. And the question, how can you get that, how can this happen? And what you see is here, what they, in this report, which was actually a report written for the Red Cross, because the Red Cross wanted to find out whether they were also part of organization networks, which they obviously are, because they are here. And you see they kind of mention the kind of services these people need: eats regular healthy meals, has regular social contacts, and so on and so forth. Here the services are mentioned, so here kind of the functional demands are mentioned. Here the services are mentioned, and here at the back there should be some organizations who actually have to provide these services. 5 minutes. And then the question is, of course, again, when you look at that, that looks brilliantly nice, yeah? Starting from the client, thinking about the things this client needs, thinking about the services, and then the question is, but who is in charge, or who will be in charge to make this happen? Yeah. So that's another example of that same thing. So the differentiation and integration paradox, what is it actually? It is that when we talk about complex challenges, and I would define this as a complex challenge, and the one before as well, when you have complex challenges, you need a high level of differentiation. That means you need many different types of organizations. In the case of the household with the abuse, it was 22 organizations. But at the same time, you need a way of integration. You need to integrate that system in some way or the other, and you have no unity of ownership, legal person, or you have no authority. So that's the integration differentiation paradox. Why is it a paradox? Because very often, I don't know whether this is in your case, we have the tendency to limit the differentiation, which makes the product much less interesting. We limit the differentiation because then we have less integration challenges. If we have to work with 2 or 3 organizations, it's easier to think about who is in charge and how do we organize that. But in many situations, you need 20 organizations, and then the question is, how do you do that? So that's the differentiation integration paradox. You need to maximize differentiation and integration at the same time. Now, how do we do that? And that's the last part. I'll takes 4 minutes. Now we have these 2 paradoxes now, and what will be the solution? Yeah, I'm now managing the Tilburg Institute of Governance. So what do you think is the answer? That's governance, of course. The governance of the network. So we have to think about the governance of the networks, and I have been thinking a little bit about that. And as I said, I have been asked to consult on this issue because what happened here, the inspectorate looked at that situation, and they saw that the money of the government was just went to a board of that region, and the board, that were the 14 directors of the board of these different schools, and they had one meeting, and they just kind of divided the money among themselves. So, and the idea was that is not actually what we want. So we have to think about another type of governance, and that was actually the consultancy. That's what they actually asked me. How can you build a network? Because the idea is not that only the schools are in this network, but of course all the other care and I don't know other type of organizations, special needs schools, but also other type of organizations, free time and these kind of things need to be part of that. So the governance of this system was completely not in line with with the result they should produce. And I have done previous research on the governance of networks, where we actually have identified 3 ways of governance. We call that the shared governance. That means you share all the decisions among each other all the time. That sounds the more sympathetic type of governance, because we're equal and so on and so forth. But it has a lot of disadvantages, we found out. It is a limit to differentiation. So if you introduce organizations who are very different than your own organization, you will not introduce them. Nevertheless, this might be a win situation for the client. Here we have a lead organization. That's one of the organizations in the primary process who takes the lead. A certain school takes the lead to build a network for healthy food or something like that. And here you have the situation where you start up an NAO. We call it a network administrative organization. So that's an organization who is really only managing the network as such. This is, of course, it turns out to be a very effective way of governing an organization, but at the same time, it is also very often very difficult, because this might easily turn into a classical hierarchy, with the NAO being on the top. The result being that some of these organizations say, "Okay, I was never looking for another boss, so I'm not part of it anymore." So this functioning, and there has been written a lot by now about the functioning of a proper NAO, and I can share more about this later. I have here I have some predictors for these governance forms, but I will not go into that. Except, for example, I find it one of our most important findings, because you also said in the beginning, but trust is important. We found that trust. Sometimes there is no trust, and for us that's no reason not to collaborate. So you have to find a way to deal with that situation where there is no trust and you nevertheless need to collaborate, and the answer is the appropriate governance form. Yeah, but I'll say something about that. And that's my last slide, because I thought we're talking about accountability and all these kind of things. So I was actually thinking of making a list, and maybe that's a little bit more for discussion later, a list of things where you can show, and this is also based on research, and I can also send the references. I was just a little bit short of time, but it has been shown that if you choose the proper governance arrangement, so the question here is, or the point here is, these are different governance arrangements. They're not the only possible. The literature in the meantime has also described other forms, but these are still considered the three main forms. You really have to think about your governance form. So it's really very important that you think in some situations, especially when starting an organization network, this might be the best. When it's a small network, this is the best. When it's a very large network of 30, 40 organizations, that's the only choice. So you really have to think in terms of governance for designing your network. And when you think about governance, you can solve many problems which are related to these paradoxes. For example, if your network is increasing in the number of organizations and the differentiation, the appropriate governance might be an answer for that. If there is no trust or a low level of trust, yeah, you see that here. Here you need a lot of trust. That's also why you will have the same type of organization, and the differentiation will be low. Here you need the least trust, because there is a kind of a lead organization. And here you have a little bit more trust. So no time to explain this all in detail, but just the principle that the choice of governance can solve a lot of problems. Governance arrangements can facilitate the use of quality assurance and network governance in education. I just saw a paper just published 2018, where actually they tried to show that if we compare ranking, what do you have? Ranking, performance contracts, and what would be the other, the third way? Visitation? No, visitatie? Yeah, audit. Yeah, if you would compare them with each other, and then the best fit would be between performance contracts and certain governance forms when it comes to organization networks. Just a PhD which was finished in Tilburg at our university, where somebody was talking about network liability. That's really a big issue. Where is the liability in networks? And also here she found a very clear relationship between choosing the right governance principle and the governance form and the liability. And it will be different for, she found actually 3 ways of liability. But it's really very dependent on the type of governance you have installed. Governance arrangements can offer that's my new research, for solutions for the basic problems of every organization. Over every organizational system, be it a small organization or a large organization, they always have to think about how they organize the division of labor and the integration of efforts, and the governance arrangements play a very important role in that. And here I put a question. I took actually that part of, it's also to the next talk at Alva's presentation. Can governance arrangements offer starting points for inspection modes and models capable of evaluating and guiding the quality of network operations to validate and support it? So my conclusion is, organization networks are new forms. We will see them more and more often. They are very interesting because they produce very interesting outcomes for end users in the first place, but they're very complicated, and we expect them also to be effective, not just to be fun, but to be effective, to be reliable, to show to be transparent on their performance. So we expect all these things of these organizations. And my answer, and might be more specific about that in the discussion maybe, is that we really have to look at the governance of these networks to make the link between these different topics. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. We can take a couple of questions before we have our tea break. Are there any questions?
I'm just thinking about one of the last things you said about how governance arrangements can compensate in a way for low levels of trust in this sort of organizations. But when you have like public service networks, where the pressure is on, so usually you don't have time to really think about the governance, and then everyone is trying to maximize the experience for the end user. So I'm thinking in education, I think it was David Reynolds who said that there are like failure-free organizations. You need to think about schools as like air controllers or something. You cannot fail, so you need to take a lot of decisions very quickly. Have you seen examples where this sort of organizations that need to take a lot of quick actions can sort of like agree on a proper governance structure when there are low levels of trust?
Yeah, you see the low level of trust. You'll see that you see that especially in this form. So you have an organization which takes the lead. For example, I had a medical doctor in the Netherlands, and she saw many, not many, but once in a while she got in her cabinet, she got an abused child, and she observed that child must have abused her for more than 1 year, and she said, "This is a dramatic situation. Why we are living in a community? How is it possible that a child is being abused for more than 1 year and nobody knows this and nobody reports this?" So she started a network as a leader, a very quick, a quick detection and response on child abuse. And she was a lead organization, and she moved very far, quick in that, and she actually used this kind of story or the evidence, the empirical evidence she had, to convince other organizations to become part of that network. That went very fast. Now, in such a network, this will not happen, and here, before you have set up a network organization, that will also not happen. So here that works. In many cases, it doesn't work. In many cases, the lead organization is a public organization like a ministry or a municipal organization, education or so, and they also see something, and they want to take the lead, and that very often does not happen because other organizations will not trust that organization. So we'll see that people like the medical doctor, who is a very engaged woman and so on and so forth, she will get trust in this position. If you take a big organization like a hospital or a municipal organization and they try to do that, that will not work. That we have found in research, because the other organizations always think they have another agenda. Either it's a hospital and they want to fill their beds when they're empty and they want to defill them when they're full, or a municipality, it's about the money, so they don't want to spend more money, and so on and so forth. So that doesn't work. So there is now going on research asking the question, what should a public organization do when they know this, that they want to move fast, take the lead, and know in advance that they will be distrusted. And there are also governance solutions for that. Yeah.
Which would perhaps include setting up an NEO or under...
That's one way.
Reducing regulation perhaps,
Yeah. Another way is, which seems to be successful, is that when you know this, that you will be in that governance game, so to say, but that's of course already a step. When you know that you're in that governance game, what you do, you try to identify in the network the organization who is the closest and most passionate about the issue, and you ask them to take the lead. That's a way. And you say we as a public organization, we have some roles in that network, the role of financing, and that's our role. But the objective of the network is something different, and somebody else takes the lead. Because the problem here is very often that these, let's say, big organizations or this public organization, they think if they take the lead, control and financing are always together. And you have to disentangle, and that's one of the tricks of governing networks, disentangle the different roles independent of the organizations, and then you can move on. Yeah.
It's time to have coffee and tea now, but I think hopefully that will allow also for an opportunity to kind of talk about some of these issues amongst each other, particularly as I kept wondering or thinking about how this applies to multi-academy trusts in England as well. I think there are really key learnings from this as well for how multi-academy trusts can perform better some of the issues they've been facing here as well, and to explain that from a kind of more organizational perspective. So we might pick up on that in the discussion at the end as well. So a brief break until about 11:15. Now Brian continues with another very interesting session, I think. So I'm really happy to introduce Alvaro Gonzalez Torres, and we've been working the last year on a number of occasions around this project as well, but also we've been working with the Quality Assurance Agency in Chile, who is thinking about how to hold these networks accountable as well. So thinking about examples of what good evaluation frameworks should look like when evaluating these new territories, and when that evaluation framework needs to kick in. So that's some of the context or background to this work as well. But you will be talking particularly about the introduction of these networks, I think, and how they developed over time. So I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you, Melanie. Morning, everyone. First of all, just a quick introduction about where I come from. So I'm working in this kind of like a research and development center around educational leadership. There was a way it was created by the ministry in 2015, and this is a consortia of three Chilean universities and the University of Toronto, in addition to the Fundación Chile, which is a non-profit foundation working on issues related to education and innovation. So in 2015, we started this center, and the main idea was that the Ministry of Education, who is funding the center, was expecting us to develop capacity for leadership and improvement in public schools in Chile. So it was a very broad remit. There are a lot of different strands and different teams that are working in the center. And we're also very grateful with Melanie and David, who've been working with us in the past couple of years in different instances. So for us, this was an opportunity. So we had like two choices in the center. One was just to do what the ministry wanted us to do, basically do a lot of school leader training and write a lot of like top tips documents for head teachers and that sort of thing. Or we can do it the hard way and trying to come up with like a more innovative approach to capacity development. So this project is framed by this idea of doing it the hard way, taking the long road. So we started working with school networks. School networks in Chile are sort of like a new thing, but an old thing as well at the same time. I was just talking to two colleagues here from Chile. All rural schools have been working in networks for the past 20 or 25 years as part of one of the first school improvement initiatives that we had in the country after the dictatorship and in the mid-1990s. So because of isolation, geographical isolation of rural schools, the idea was how to reach those school populations, those school communities, And so basically what the people at the time thought was, we don't have the human capacity to go to each of schools. So we're going to provide some resources for them to get together, geographically get together and start working together. So it started out as a sort of like a functional network, so to speak. It was aimed at solving the issue of isolation of rural schools. But over time, it has been developing a spirit of its own in terms of like a rural education identity, trying to solve issues sort of like how to teach in multi-grade classrooms. So usually in rural schools in Chile, you have a group of 5-year-olds with 7s and 8s and 9s. So you have like a very diverse classroom. So you address the same topics from the national curriculum, but at different levels of difficulty depending on the ages of the kids. So that's very challenging for teachers in terms of planning, in terms of execution of the learning experiences, but also in terms of evaluation. And they've been very, very successful, most of them, in addressing this issue in their networks. One funny thing, though, is that this program was started in the mid-1990s, and by the early 2000s, the ministry kind of like forgot about that, and this network just kept running on their own. So it's been very organic, the development that they've been having in the past 10 or 15 years. As opposed to, in 2015, the Ministry of Education decided that networks should be expanded to all public schools. And that is basically all urban schools that were not part of these rural networks. But this time it was a mandate. There were guidelines, ministry supervisors who are kind of like technical advisors or something like that, were in charge of the networks. They work with the municipal departments of education. I'm going to show you a slide later to explain how the system is organized. So the dynamic, and my question at the end of Patrick's presentation about governance, the dynamics and the organization, the internal governance structure of these networks was very, very different from that of the rural schools. So for us it was very interesting when we started the center, sort of like the same time they launched this initiative of school improvement networks with urban schools. It was very interesting for us to see the differences in the way that these networks were seeing themselves as collectives, right? And now there's a kind of like a third wave of networking in Chile, which is associated with a very deep reform to public education. So for several years, well, by the way, this is Chile. For people who didn't know, Chile is the longest country in the world, apparently. The other day I saw this map that was overlapped on Europe. So Chile goes from kind of like the top of Scotland to the Mediterranean, basically. So it's a very long country, very thin country. So any huge tsunami and we're going to be washed away. So if you want to see the country, go now. Because with the temperatures rising because of climate change, we probably don't have much time to visit us. This was the structure until 2017. This was the way the system was organized. And this organizational or governance structure of the school system was implemented during the dictatorship in Chile. Chile had a 17-year-long dictatorship from 1973 to 1990. And at the time, the public schools were run by the state. Yeah. And the dictatorship decided to start what they call a modernization of the state. And they devolved the responsibility for providing the educational service to municipalities. And at the same time, they also created something very similar to charter schools or academies, which is private subsidized schools. So it's private organizations, or at some point it's also some individual people. So I can have a school and receive government funding to run it. and they are called people who cooperate with the state in providing education. Yeah. So our public school system is basically these two strands: the municipal administration, the private administration. Both receive state subsidy in the form of a voucher, and that's the way the system was being organized until 2017. And the previous government of Michelle Bachelet, they decided that, well, not decided, they took stock of the accumulated evidence that said that this way of organizing the system was playing against municipal schools. Municipal schools concentrate most of the rural schools, most of the low socioeconomic groups of students, and at the same time also concentrate the lowest performance in terms of education quality. And the idea was, and several studies prove that has to do with kind of like unfair rules of the game. Municipal schools had a very strong disadvantage against private subsidized schools and private fee-paying schools. So in 2017, a law was passed that created the local public education services. So local public education services came in to replace municipal administration. And I'm going to give you a little bit of overview of that change to understand the study that we are running right now. But this is the third wave of networking in our system, because the intention is that local public education services will be organized as a network. And at the same time, they will organize networks of schools specifically for several, I think it's a list of 5 or 6 goals that they need to achieve. Amongst them, school improvement, which is no easy feat. So I just took this bit from the seminar's website because it says something very interesting. The purpose of these new organizational forms, networks, is to ensure and guarantee educational quality and equity in a territory. So when Patrick was talking about why would different organizations come together, and he explained different ways of coming together, of organizational coordination in a way, this is a case for most of networks that are created in the education field. Usually is to address issues of equity or quality. And then you break it down in more specific terms. For instance, the example that Patrick showed from the Netherlands in terms of providing like inclusive education. There's a very good example in Scotland as well that Chris Chapman has written a lot about in terms of the School Improvement Partnership Program, the regional alliances as well, or the regional alliances or something like that. And there was this example from the network learning communities here in England, in Canada as well. So there are several examples, and all of them, and in the end, point towards either quality or equity or both. And they try to address this from an interconnected, collaborative perspective. So following that lead, in our country, this change from municipal education to local education services is trying to mimic that in a way. What was the rationale for changing this organizational or governance structure in the system? Basically, Chile, as many school systems or education systems in the world, is organized as a decentralized system. But decentralization is a bit tricky. Unless you are like Finland, there's no like true decentralization. There's always something that holds in the center. And in the case of Chile, usually you have this figure of the Ministry of Education, who has this role of steering the system at a distance through different kind of like incentives in a way. So incentives in terms of evaluation systems, in terms of curriculum frameworks, in terms of accountability measures. So you declare that schools have autonomy to develop their educational projects, but at the same time, schools are very well aware that they need to meet certain standards in terms of curriculum evaluation or whatever. So some examples here. In terms of curriculum frameworks, we have a national curriculum, which is very it's very long in a sense. It has a lot of contents. Like they're called minimum compulsory contents, but most teachers call them maximum mandatory contents, because they don't have time to do anything else outside those contents. It's actually very hard to cover them all over the school year. So, but at the same time, legislation provides up to 30% of teaching time for schools to decide what to do, like, freely. So, for instance, if you have a school that have an educational project that gives emphasis to sports, you could use that kind of like allowance of teaching time to do activities related to sport, right? But at the same time, you still have to comply with the minimum contents of the curriculum. So it's a very tricky situation for schools. So this is sort of like my reinterpretation of what network governance looks like in the current context of the Chilean school system. So the network governance is basically consists basically of like three issues. This complex and interdependent relationships. So you have a complicated issue in terms of how schools will come together to cooperate and work together when there are no incentives for them to do so. At the same time, you have many decision-making centers, which is not different from other places. So you have schools making some decisions on curriculum, but then at the same time you have municipalities or local education services or private owners of schools making decisions about the direction of the school. And then at the same time you have a collection action framed by desired outcomes. And these desired outcomes are usually standards that are national standards in terms of evaluation, curriculum, as I just said. So framed by these three issues, network governance is basically we need to work together because we cannot solve these problems by ourselves. And this is the main rationale of why networks have been introduced more decisively in the Chilean school system in the later years. So keep that in mind when you see some of the preliminary results of the study that I'm going to show you later. And as I told you just now, this is it's not a new thing. It's something that's been going on for quite a while now in education. Collaborative arrangements are being highlighted as kind of like a fourth way of change in a way. If you follow like the ages of change that David Hopkins was writing about many years ago, it's like the fourth or the fifth or something, and it's usually one on top of the other. But the idea that collaboration can basically release the potential of untapped capacity in schools or in professionals is something that's been going around the education field for quite a while. But the main difference from my perspective, at least, is that networks imply, as I wrote there, a shift or a change from bureaucratic or market ways of organizing school systems. So in the case of Chile, we have a market-driven system where schools compete for students' enrollment because students' enrollment is attached to funding. Schools receive money in terms of how many kids they have enrolled in the school and how many of those kids actually attend the school. So month after month you can have different numbers of money being put into the school. So if usually it's the case that in the winter months, kids get sick, they stay at home, and the amount of money that the school gets that month is lower than in the summer months. So, but you still have to pay the full salary of all your staff. You still have to have money for maintenance issues. You still need to keep doing the work that you're doing, even if it's with 15 kids in the classroom or 25 or 30. So the idea is that schools will strive to provide, this is the market logic, the schools will strive to provide the best service for the users, for the clients, in this case the families, and the families will respond in kind with preference. They will prefer to take their kids to that school. And those successful schools, in a sense, will succeed in the detriment of less successful schools. It's a zero-sum game at the end. And that's the way that the school system in Chile was set up. The quality was going to be driven up by competition between schools for enrollment. But then you introduce this idea of networking and collaboration and working together to achieve goals that we cannot achieve by ourselves. So here, borrowing from Patrick as well, here's one huge paradox. When you are basically your livelihood and your subsistence as a school depends on being better than the other. But at the same time, the system is also giving you a very strong signal that it's best if you work with others. So let's see how that works in reality. At the same time, there's another kind of like point of pressure. So that was one huge point of pressure, this idea that you should work with others and in order to solve complex issues, but at the same time you're competing with those same organizations. But this other important point of pressure is the idea that schools have been judged individually in terms of their quality. There's a very high stakes, standard-based accountability system in Chile. We have something of an Ofsted as well, who does inspections to schools, but not quite like here, not quite like in England, in terms that when people from the quality agency, that's the name of the organization, when people from the quality agency visit the school, the school is already being labeled, or they already have their evaluation. So they just go there to kind of like give some feedback to the school in terms of why they were labeled as there are 4 labels. Insufficient, they're very funny, they're actually ludicrous. Insufficient is the lowest performance category. Then you have middle low. Then you have middle performance, and then you have high performance. So it's very weird, but in a sense, those labels are not very informative. So the agency has this strategy to go and visit the insufficient and when they have the time and the people necessary to do that, also the middle low schools, but mostly the insufficient schools. And they go there, they stay there for like 3 days. They observe classes, lessons. They talk to a lot of people. They do interviews and whatever, and then they give structured feedback to all the school community, teachers, school leaders, sometimes parents and students if they wish them to be there. And interestingly, schools are very grateful of that, because when they just receive the label, they don't know what to do with it. They don't really know how to make sense of it. But when these people from the agency go to their schools, they kind of like understand why they were labeled like that. The problem is that they're not very sure how to get out of that label, how to improve in a way. And that's the role of the Ministry of Education. And the Ministry of Education decided, as I told you a minute ago, in 2015, that it was more efficient to do that in a network environment rather than one-to-one. So you have this individual accountability and evaluation system working alongside and in parallel with this idea that you could improve together. So it's also very confusing for some people because they believe that sometimes their issues are very much their own and their problems are very unique to their schools. But, and in that sense, they think, I don't have time to go out and spend, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours in a network meeting talking about other people's problems when I have my own problems and I need to solve them. But there's also the case, and we've seen that in the past couple of years, that people go to these meetings, these network meetings, convened by the ministry supervisor, and then when they get there, they realize that their problems are not that unique. They have shared issues that they can probably address together. So it's very interesting how this is been playing out. And what we have found is that the law that replaced municipalities with local education services kind of like learned from that experience, and they decided that well, this is what I wanted to point out just a minute ago. We had 345 municipal governments in Chile, municipalities. So each municipality was a system in its own. They had their own schools and they made their own rules and they provided their own policies other than the national policies. Now they're going to be replaced progressively with 70 local education services, because the logic is that we didn't have a school system. We had a collection of 345 systems in Chile. So now the idea is that these local education services will work as integrated systems of public education. So, and they have this, well, these are the main responsibilities: to design and deliver pedagogical and management support to all schools, ensure and guarantee education quality and equity in the territory, and to achieve that, they propose networking as a way of moving from competition to collaboration. And this was very much informed by the experience of this rural school networks and urban school networks, when they realized that there was schools were kind of like ready and interested in doing this despite the disincentives of the system. Just a quick recap of the law that created the local education services. Collaboration networking is considered both, not both, at the same time it's considered as a principle that is underpinning this change in the system, as a functional foundation. So the idea is that these local education services will work and operate as a network, and also as a strategy for capacity building. So I don't know if this clarifies anything from my point of view. This just models everything up again. But legal texts are usually like that. They usually give a lot of hints, but not very clear instructions how to do things. So promoting networking and collaboration is considered at the same time also a mandate. They need to do this, and it's written in the law. And as you say, when it's law, you need to find a way to comply with it. We were just talking about compliance just a while ago. In Spanish, when compliance it's cumplimiento. So usually people have this phrase that cumplimiento is cumplo y miento. I fulfill the requirement and I lie about it. So you can call it complies or something. This creates a very hard context for the first four local education services that came into operation this year. So this is everything very new. The study that I'm going to talk about in this next couple of minutes, it's basically about the first 2 local education services that started operating in March this year. Just the 1st of March was the first day they started working. Then in July this year, 2 additional local education services began their operation. And so we had to leave those two cases outside of the study because we needed, because of funding issues and whatever, we needed to start in May this year, the latest. So this is an exploratory case study of two local education services, and we were concentrating on finding out about these three issues, which are like kind of like critical issues for the formation stage of networks. First is how relationships are established and within the local education services, but also between the local education service and the schools. The second issue that we are inquiring about is the purpose or purposes. We're open to more than one purpose. The goals and the values that are defined by the local education service and the schools as well. And the governance structure, which is a key issue, at least from my perspective, in terms of what are the choices that these local education services are taking in terms of how we're going to organize ourselves. And so we've been asking about internal organization processes and strategies, and also about whether they have any evaluation and improvement mechanisms. And as you can imagine, there's a little bit of the first and almost none of the second because of the short time frame they've been operating. So these are the two cases. One is a local education service from the central region in Chile, and another one is in the northern region in Chile. The first one used to be 3 municipalities that have mostly urban schools. So there are 54 schools and 23 early years centers. In Chile, usually early year centers like nurseries and the like are kind of like could be part of a regular primary school, or they can be kind of like independent early year centers. In this case, I made the difference just to show you that they're not run the same way, right? And this is also at the same time related to the way the local education services are being thinking about setting up networks. They're not XX teachers and XX are classroom teachers. I think that, well, I forgot to put the number there, but there are about 2,000 and something teachers in the first local education service, and about 1,500 of those are classroom teachers. And there's 25,000 students from pre-K to 12th grade, which is the compulsory education in Chile. So from what do you call it? Pre-kinder, kinder, whatever. Yeah. I know here in England that it's from 2 years onwards, I think, or from 4 years onwards, probably, until 15. When the kids are 15, that's at the end of compulsory education, 16. Yeah. Right. In Chile, it's from 3-year-olds to 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds. So there's a lot of students there. And the other one, it used to be 2 municipalities, one big urban municipality and one smaller one with a higher share of rural schools. So there are 40 schools and 11 early year centers, a little more than 1,000 teachers, and a little less than 1,000 are classroom teachers. The other ones are head teachers, deputies, and that sort of people, and about 13,000 students. So as you can see, these are kind of like middle-sized systems in comparison to other countries. Before that, you have this 77 school centers divided in these 3 municipalities. So, and in this case, it was a bit more extreme, because the one big urban municipality had about 35 or 38 schools, and the smaller one had the other share of schools, like 6 or 7, plus a couple early year centers. So we had like very different sizes of municipalities, and now they are like more rounded in terms of like local education services will have about 60 to 80 schools and in any given case. So in terms of funding, that's very important, because you can have sustainable systems, because funding is based on students' enrollment. If you have a lot of schools, you can have more students. You have more students, you can have more money. So that was one of the rationales to create this local education services to replace municipalities. But at the same time, it brings the problem that you had people working as in a municipal system for 30-something years, and now they need to get used to working with the people from the municipality next door, with very different cultural, organizational cultural traditions and ways of doing things. This is the data we've been collecting so far. We started out with documents because the first 3 or 4 months, I'm going to talk about it later in a while. It was more about setting up the local education service, and then recently, like from July onwards, they started actually talking about setting up the networks and everything. So we started reviewing documents. We did some interviews, and the things that the boxes in white are the things that we are not being able to do yet, but we're going to get around that very soon. And what we have so far is not much, but I think it's very promising in terms of what's going to happen in the next couple of months until the end of the school year in Chile. The school year in Chile ends in December, starts in March and ends in December. And what's going to happen next year in the 2019 academic year. So there's issues about the action framework of local education services. And in terms of what the documents say that these services have to do in terms of networking is that they provided some non-mandatory guidelines, which is kind of like a wishy-washy thing. But they proposed that local education services could create one of these 5 types of networks. So you have school leader networks, teacher networks, pastoral care networks, interprofessional psychosocial support networks. Now you have there, for instance, people who work with special needs students, but like, for instance, psychologists and special need teachers and other kinds of like social workers as well and everything. And problem-focused networks, which is kind of like something that probably they throw around there, because usually schools, based on the experience of these urban networks that I told you about earlier, they realize that usually you get like networks integrated of different types of schools and different types of professionals, because they work together to solve one specific problem, one specific issue. And then when that issue or that problem is solved, they disband. So they wanted to open that opportunity for local education services to take advantage of that experience. The main goal independent of the type of network that you create, the main goal from the perspective of these guidelines is to strengthen schools' pedagogical processes and strive towards a continuous improvement of education quality, not an easy feat. So when we started talking to people about this, they say, yeah, sure, we're all on board of that, but we need to solve some big problems first. So when you replace one organizational structure with a new one, you have a lot of transitional problems. And specifically, the difficult start of this local education services was mainly related with paying teachers their salary. Every municipality had a different system for keeping the accounts and keeping the payrolls of their teachers. And when you bring together 3 different organizational routines to do this very important part of the process, administrative process, problems are going to arise anyway. So one of the deputy directors of this local education services said, I cannot ask teachers to teach unless to do a good job if we are not paying their salaries. And at the same time, most of the people who were working in the local education service at the time for the first 4 months or so were mostly dedicated to collect good quality data from the municipalities to set up all of the administrative issues they needed to set up, not just paying salaries, but also some retirement issues, hiring people, infrastructure, coordinating with other institutions. None of those things were while well set up when 1st of March came and the local education services was beginning their operation formally. So they even had some teachers walking out the first week of the school year because they weren't paid correctly the month before. So it was a very, very difficult, very rough start. And the people who were in charge of, in the local education service, who are in charge of providing pedagogical support, they were mostly dedicated to go to each of the schools and collect data. Like they were collecting names and different kinds of data of teachers in order to find out whether they've been paid correctly or not, and what were the differences and everything. So not much of setting up networks and talking about school improvement and quality improvement and none of those things. And the final issue that's been coming up in the interviews lately, it's how to assemble professional teams that are able to produce the kind of collaboration and the kind of work, the joint work that will facilitate collaboration instead of competition among schools. So similar to what happened with the information that came from different municipalities with different ways of working, the local education services were staffed with in 3 ways, mostly with people from the same municipalities who used to run schools. So there was a direct transfer for like senior managers of the departments of education of the municipalities were directly transferred to the local education service. So you had the head of education of municipality A and the head of education of municipality B being transferred directly to the new local education service. Then in a second wave of staffing, you had internal applications. So people, professionals who used to work for those municipalities in the education department, they had the advantage of applying for jobs in the local education service. So up to that point, more or less like 60% of the staff was imported from the municipalities. So they had different organizational cultures, different ways of doing things, different ways of providing support to schools. So one of the key issues that the deputy directors I talked to said it was how to bring together these different ways of doing things. And at the same time, how to kind of like break with the old and start a new way of doing things when you have the same people who were running this show for 30 odd years. Only a small proportion in terms of the first local education services, it was 60-40. In the other case, it was more like 70-30 in terms of people from municipalities and new external people. But at the same time, these new external people who had the experience and fulfilled the profile and everything, most of them had passed through municipal departments of education in their careers. They had that experience too. So how can you promote a different way of doing things when you have people who were used to doing things in the old way? And what is the role of the leaders in the local education service to trying to break with that old tradition or kind of like rescue the positive features and trying to bring new ways of doing things? Oh, well, and at the same time, all of the people I talked to, they say that one of the key issues is that they're understaffed. So they have 109 people in total, considering people from the legal department, communications, administrative staff, and professionals who work with schools. In total is 109 in the first local education service. 109 people to provide services to 77 schools and early year centers. So they feel very much overwhelmed by the bulk of things they need to do. So just to summarize, in terms of the 3 issues that we are inquiring about in this study, network formation is local education services in terms of relationships up to this point has been more about getting to know each other, but not like getting to know the schools. It's actually getting to know the group of people who are being transferred to the local education service. So they're in this process of building internal trust, and in order to and while at the same time they are also going to the schools and talking to head teachers and trying to solve their problems and trying to provide support, but trying to come together and decide what's the way that we're going to work now as a group, as a team. And that has had some problems in terms of differences in opinions, people who are not very much on board with the new things. So some difficult decisions that had to be made. In terms of the purpose and goals and values that this local education service as a network and trying to set up networks with schools, there's a mix of internal and external purposes. So the external purpose is what the law says, basically. You need to strive towards quality improvement and everything. But then at the same time, internally, is more about solving these everyday administrative issues. Like we need to solve the salary issues, we need to solve the infrastructure issues. So not much about pedagogical talking, like about how to do better lessons, how to manage the school in a way that you create conditions for improvement. So they all think that that's the final destination, that's what they strive to do, but they're not being able to do it now because they had to deal with all these other things so far. And in terms of governance, it's more about like the functional organization of networks so far. So when they talk about what they want to do with the network, with the schools, setting up networks of schools, they've been talking about two different strategies. One local education service is talking about organizing zones in the territory. So they basically what they did was drew two lines divided in 4 areas, and a group of people is in charge of the area A, B, C, D. But what they realize in time is that usually those lines don't need to be straight lines. They need to be more nuanced, the separation. So they've been trying to adjust these zones month after month in terms of what makes more sense for schools. And at the same time, these zones also didn't actually fit with the early year centers. That's why I put them in a different point, because early year centers are scattered around the territory. So you can have like one early year center working in a zone where there are mostly vocational secondary schools. So the kinds of issues where they can see eye to eye or the kinds of issues they can solve together are very restricted. In the other case, they are thinking about setting up networks by actors. They don't want to set up teacher networks so far because they have this problem that teachers have most of their contract time in the classroom. So taking them out of the classroom will increase the cost of the operation. So what they're doing is taking people like head teachers, deputies, people in charge of pastoral care and that sort of thing, to set up networks and work together by actors and trying to develop territory-wide policies in their areas of expertise. Just to summarize and to finish the presentation, the idea of this seminar is to talk about the paradoxes. So I kind of like been trying to hint at these 3 issues. One is that networks are being thought as vehicles for a cultural change or a cultural shift from competition to collaboration. But certain features of the school system are still pushing towards competition, while at the same time there are certain hints that schools should collaborate. So networks are in that weird space where they have this tension between how deep should be my engagement with this network when I need to care for my own pressure points, right? The second issue is that this sort of like creates this really complex scenario when you have instability, when as Patrick said, some schools, in terms of like schools as organizations, they feel they lose autonomy when they have to make decisions alongside other schools. They need to change their routines. They need to change the way they make they do their work in order to comply with the rule of the majority. So this could bring some undesired consequences of networking and collaboration, like, for instance, groupthink, fragmentation, some transactional costs in terms of staff, infrastructure, and that sort of things. And the final, more kind of like policy-wide issue and paradox is that the national and soon-to-be local guidelines for setting up networks kind of like look for like doing this process of nudging schools towards collaboration, and they paint a very pretty picture of it. But at the same time, these guidelines, if they are taken to the word, they could sort of like become the new standards. So you will be trying to promote a more innovative, more flexible way of working, but at the same time standardized by this national and soon-to-be local guidelines for networking. So there will only be 5 types of networks, no more than 5. There will only be 7 criteria to set up. There will only be 1 governance structure. So there's a risk that when providing some guidelines, you will also be providing what could be the basis for standardizing collaboration in among schools. This is what we need to do next, but I'm happy to end here with the presentation, so thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, really interesting, and I was just really kind of reflecting on how we somehow always want to standardize in education, how that is almost kind of a first response to anything, even with the introduction of networks, that there is this need to even standardize that, which really goes against the core premise of networks as an organizing form that needs to be flexible and needs to kind of address local issues as well. So quite interesting to hear the process in Chile, I think. Are there any questions for Alvaro at this, particularly about this presentation? Questions or clarification, comments? Yeah.
I was thinking about Patrick's talk before about effectiveness and efficiency. To what extent is there a narrative that the networks are meant to be more efficient as well as more effective? Because we talked about achieving more as a network than they do individually. But is there, and I was wondering, in relation to staffing, for instance, is that staffing now much less than it was? Presumably, it's less than it was for the 2 or 3 or whatever number of municipalities there were.
Yeah, well, sorry.
Thanks.
No, is that okay?
Yeah, if you hold it there, that'd be fine.
Not very good at this. Okay, cool. So, David, to your question. Thank you. So the ministry is very interested in finding out whether networks are effective or not. So they are been asking us for the past 2 or 3 years to evaluate what networks actually produce in Chile. And we're talking about, I'm talking about these urban networks I mentioned during the presentation. There's a lot of evidence elsewhere that says that networks could be effective under certain circumstances, and they can show some differential effects in terms when compared to schools that do not work in collaborative arrangements. But we don't have that kind of evidence in Chile. It's very difficult to assess that in such a short time of this massification of networking. And at the same time, since networks are kind of like operating much on their own in terms of there's no kind of like structured program how to do networking, It's very hard to compare whether some networks are more effective because they found a more efficient solution to fix their problems than others. So in a sense, it's more an aspiration than evidence. When this issue of networking was introduced in the law was because of the international literature saying that networking and collaboration as an approach to urban school reform was successful in certain places. But there's not much evidence in Chile of whether that is true or not. What we've seen it in terms of more anecdotal evidence is that some municipalities who started working as networks from 2015 onwards, they have been able to solve certain issues that were kind of like perennial to them. For instance, low attainment in reading tests. We know of one municipality who bucked the trend, and the last year actually they bucked the trend. They had very low stagnated results in reading, and last year they saw the first climb up, and this year they're expecting another one. So, and that's because they started working as a network. They started working on a reading program that was implemented by all schools in the municipality. And that reading program was designed by the same deputies in charge of curriculum of the schools. So it wasn't a program that they bought from outside. It was something that they developed based on the experiences that they had in their individual schools. They came together and they devised a way of expanding that to other schools.
So how would government then define effectiveness? How, I mean, there is this sense and a requirement to collaborate, but for what purpose? Is that defined in legislation at all?
The legislation says what it was there on the slide, that networking has to strengthen the capacity, the capacity of the schools, and strive towards educational improvement. And educational improvement in Chile is very much defined by our national examination, which is a standard-based test that is aligned with the curricular standards. So it all comes back to the same issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question there as well.
In order to overcome this paradox and this tension between the competitive element between schools and the need for system improvement, do we not need to think about the measures by which we hold the units to account? So do we not need to shift from holding them to account on the basis of their own performance to actually say, well, it's their contribution to the system improvement that is going to be the accountability measure that we bring into place?
Yeah, we've been talking about this quite a lot as well, and also kind of from the EU project that I mentioned at the start, and this is actually a key finding from our case study in England as well, which shows that if you have very strong accountability on the school level, which we have here in England with Ofsted and league tables and all of that, that actually prevents integration of schools into the network, because what we've seen is that the large multi-academy trusts, they develop structures particularly around individual school improvement. So targeted support towards individual schools, how they decide on resources is based on individual school performance. So everything is still organized around those individual school accountability standards, preventing any kind of joint outcome to develop over time. But I wonder if you've got similar experiences in Chile as well.
Yeah, well, you mentioned when I was starting the presentation that we've been talking with the quality agency, kind of like over Ofsted, about this, because there's a provision in legislation as well that says that quality agency has to inspect local education services as well. So the quality agency devised this system to inspect schools, which took them quite a while to come up with and to try and test and everything. And now they are faced with the additional task of inspecting and evaluating the performance of local education services. There's no way around it. It's in legislation. They need to do it. So we've been talking about that quite a while, because when they first thought about doing this, they thought, okay, we just add up all the individual evaluations of schools, and that is sort of like an aggregated score of the local education services or the municipality or the private subsidized administrator performance. So if all of your schools are good, you are good. If most of your schools are not good, you're not good. But then we started talking to them, and we started talking about this idea that the evaluation of networks should be around network level outcomes. So there are a lot of factors that had to do with the individual performance of schools. But you have those same factors exponentially grown when you consider an aggregated group of schools. So what capacity has a local education services or any other intermediate organization in the school system to intervene in some of those factors, and how they can be held responsible for those that they are kind of like out of their control in a way. So if you think about them as intermediate organizations that need to create conditions for improvement at the school level, they should be held accountable for how they create those conditions, but not necessarily for the individual performance of schools, because schools have their level of autonomy to make some decisions as well. So it's a very complex problem that when I think Melanie's study also found that when you have this individual level and aggregated level accountability systems aligned in a way, in terms of my role, my responsibility as a school goes from here to here, and then this from there onwards is the responsibility of the network or the intermediate organization or whatever. It kind of works, or it could work in theory.
Yeah, we worked with this kind of framework which kind of shows how you can organize evaluation and accountability on various levels. So on the individual, school level, the network level, and how you then maybe even contribute to the performance of a community or region, and how you need to think about what are relevant standards on each of these levels. How do they interact, and what is whose responsibility? And often there's not a real structured thinking around that when new networks come into place, and there's no real thinking about, well, how does the accountability actually need to change or shift as a result from it? And yeah, that creates quite a lot of problems for networks also to actually develop something or develop some kind of collective goal or action almost.
Yeah, just a quick note that our recommendation to our quality agency was to look closely at the way Scotland is doing things in terms of aggregated or like local area or area-based inspections, in terms of how and much more based on self-evaluation and validation of that self-evaluation in terms of the outcomes that they set up for themselves as a collaborative arrangement, rather than thinking about what are the key standards for any kind of. It's very hard to standardize something that is super complex and it changes shapes all the time depending on the type of problem that they're trying to solve.
Thank you for your presentation. I think it's interesting to see when it's the really beginning of something. So maybe all these difficulties are because they're setting up a new system. But I want to hear if you heard in their vision that networking, this kind of compulsory networking, is it going to be beneficial, or they tend to think that it's more because of this compulsory element?
Interestingly, I had the chance to talk to the directors informally, the directors of the local services, formally with the deputy directors in charge of support of schools, and we did a couple of group interviews with staff that are going to the schools and doing this support role. And I don't want to say all of them, but like 99.9% of the people I talk to are quite convinced, discursively at least, quite convinced that networking and collaboration is the way to go. It works. Competition and individualization hasn't worked for us in the last 30 odd years. So we cannot do the same thing on and get the same results. And one of the people I talked to summarized it in a very nice way, that she said, if I find myself doing the things the same way I did it when I was working in the municipality, I should quit, because it didn't work and we need to do things differently. And for them, the way of doing things differently is going, setting up these networks and everything. So discursively, they're very much convinced. They don't really know how to go about it because they don't have the experience, or they haven't seen experiences firsthand. Yeah. And that's where I think the study is being kind of like pushing them on those things, and they're pushed back and during the interview saying like, do you have any information? Do you have any case studies? And then they ask us for materials and resources to learn more about that. Which has been very interesting, because when you do this kind of exploratory studies, you don't want to mess up with the phenomenon too much. But at the same time, you have also a responsibility to provide certain resources that could help them solve some issues.
Yeah, but it's also quite interesting, because apparently these networks are being set up without any thought about the resources that they need, or changes in infrastructure that is needed. Kind of the example around teacher salaries, that those issues are not sorted before you actually set up the network.
Exactly.
And that also kind of leads me to think, how does this impact on the trust within the network if you have such a difficult starting position, and that is not a real good kind of a way to sell the network to the people that have to be part of it and have to work collaboratively within it. How is that working? Do they kind of, is that reducing people's motivation to actually participate in the network?
They feel overworked, and they feel that they are not being able to concentrate on what they want to do. The people who are providing direct support to schools, and they set up these groups of schools to work together and talk together and trying to reflect together about their issues. But at the same time, they still talk about the broken window, the lack of toner on the printer, and so it's been really hard. It's been winding down in the past couple of months, but from March until May or July or June, it was all they talked about during network meetings in the first local location service. And the second one, they decided not to do any network work in the first semester, because they needed to sort out this kind of like basic issues first. And now from September onwards, they're going to start working with the networks by actors. So they figure out that they needed to sort out those things first, and then work on the others.
Thank you very much for your presentation. The micropolitics of the head teachers, for example, or the teachers in the schools. Because I think about this local level. So some of the head teachers know the deputy head teacher of the municipality, and maybe they ask something directly, and I don't know, I need some toner for the printer, so could you bring it to me? Those kind of things. That I think that with the new structure of the local service, you have another level of the structure. So maybe this feeling of the local, what is the local, might be some issues over there. I don't know what is the perception there.
In terms of politics, it's been very hard to transition, because this is something that I didn't have time to explain. But one of the issues that municipal education faced was the politicization of education. So each mayor relied on the network of schools they had, like the 10 or 15 or 20 schools they had, as an electoral platform. So they do a lot of campaigning in their schools. And now they lost that, basically. They lost that platform for campaigning. So there was a lot of resistance from the part of some mayors and some municipalities to give away, in a way, their schools. But at the same time, for municipalities, schools were a leak of money. They were losing money year on because they had to cover the cost, the operational cost that the voucher, the funding, the per pupil funding didn't cover. So most of the municipalities saw this as an opportunity to get out of a huge debt. So in terms of politics, it's been very complicated because depending on each municipality and the way the mayor thought about education, some were more resistant of losing the schools and some were quite happy to give them away. And they still have a participation in local education services. They are part of a consulting board or like a kind of like a local board, and then they do have a say on some of the decisions that the local education service will make. In terms of the micropolitics, in terms of the relationship, as you said, some municipalities, like one of the municipalities from the second local education service, was quite small, so they had like 10 schools. So the head teachers usually had direct conversations with the mayor of the city. So if they had a problem, like they didn't fix a pipe or something, they just get on the phone with the mayor and things were solved in a few hours. But now they need to talk with someone who's kind of like far from them, and it's very hard to reach the head of the local education service. So what these services have been doing is to empower the people who go to the schools to make those decisions very quickly, and they've been betting on the internal organization and the internal coordination of different teams that compose the local education service. So for instance, if I'm a professional of the support team, I go to your school and you say, like, I have this problem with heating. My heating broke and it's the middle of the winter and children are falling ill or whatever. So my responsibility is to give you an answer right away and to coordinate with internal teams that are in charge of all those things in the local education service for you. So you don't have to go there, you don't have to call anyone, you just tell me and I sort it out for you. So that adds to the role of providing pedagogical and management support to the schools. So they haven't quite figured out what's the best way of going about it, but they have been betting on that way of addressing things.
One final question.
You mentioned something about observation. I was going to ask two questions about Betty. You mentioned something about the schools being observed and the rankings, for example. To show the effectiveness of the paradox of their networks, can this be measured in this way? For example, a school was ranked, I don't know, 4, I can't remember the ranking.
One of the 4 levels,
One of the 4 levels, yeah. And maybe in time you could have measured this to be a success by them, I don't know, 1 or 2 levels, and you can attribute this to the network itself. Have you had enough time to maybe measure this?
I think in a couple of years' time we could do that, because the 2018 results are from kids who were tested on 2017 before the local education service started operating. So you could not. It will be hard to justify that those outcomes are because of the local education service operation. So next year's test, I mean, they're going to sit for the test now in October, November. So when they get those results next year, you can say that's the first evaluation when they're in full operation of the local education service. But then these kids have been taught for 4 years or 8 years or 10 years in the previous system. So methodologically, it's very hard to do that in the short term. So what they're trying to do now, the National Directorate of Public Education, is trying to look at other issues that have been changing. So for instance, how lessons have been made. So how they're planning lessons, how they're implementing lessons, doing a lot of, collecting a lot of data about enrollment, attendance, that sort of things that are more quickly changing and could be more easily assigned to the effect of being part of a local education service as opposed to be part of a municipality. But obviously that doesn't talk much about education quality. It's about conditions for good quality education.
Very, very brief.
You mentioned also the Scottish and briefly touched on the Finnish model. I know it's hard to compare countries.
Yeah.
Do you look into, for example, Patrick was talking about the Netherlands,
yes.
for example, do you look much to case studies there and maybe use some examples that could apply to a particular context as a way of maybe adding to what you have, because you have some good examples yourself, but maybe examples from other countries you can import.
For instance, there's a very interesting experience in Colombia, which is called Escuela Nueva, and they've been running that form of education for decades now, and it's very interesting because they bet a lot on the professional ethics of teachers in terms of providing education in very complex situations, in middle of conflicts or in rural areas with a lot of isolation and everything. And so they bet on popular education, which is a very strong movement in South America. What we can learn from that, for instance, is how to develop capacity at the school level and rely on the professional judgment of teachers and head teachers. That's one of the things that the local education service is striving to do. But at the same time, we're also looking at, for instance, we were looking at this study in Belgium when they set up networks based on the idea that first with economic incentives, and then they needed to solve the issue of also inclusive education and everything. There was a study that showed that the first year motivation was top one was the economic incentive, and then other things. At the sixth year of the intervention, the economic incentive was kind of like in the 10th place or something, and the first motivation to work in the network was to learn to solve problems collectively and to fight isolation. So in time, there was a 6-year time span. In time, we can learn from that you can start out with incentives or with mandatory or compulsory guidelines or whatever, but you need to allow space for networks to develop more organically and to find their best way of organizing themselves to achieve their goals. And I think that's the first key issue, that they need to sort out what they want to do together first, rather than how we're going to evaluate ourselves and how we're going to define whether we're successful or not.
And having a good infrastructure is a kind of requirement to allow that discussion to happen. I think that's a key lesson as well. Thank you everyone for joining us this morning. The next seminar is on the 14th of November, I think. Yeah, the 14th of November. So I hope you can join us for that one as well, which will be around educational effectiveness. Thank you for being here, and have a good journey to work or home or wherever you're going.
Great. Thank you.